Hi, everyone. I'm back. I'm back to talk about the theme covered by the next installment of the TV series Project Blue Book. I am behind by a couple of weeks, just as I was last year when I come to think of it. Anyway, episode 6 of season 2 of Project Blue Book is a kind of interesting thing in which they cover two distinct elements in the life of J. Allen Hynek, and actually did them in a pretty artful way. But they're totally different, and I chose to cover what I think is by far the more significant of the two historically. So one thing that I elected not to cover here is Hynek's involvement in the 1970s with the Steven Spielberg, classic cinema, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's certainly not that that isn't interesting. There's a lot that we can extract out of everything connected with that movie. But even so, it's the other theme that really stands out in my mind, and probably yours if you saw the episode, and that's Hynek's retrospective on the Robertson Panel. Now, Hynek was a junior member of that panel. He wasn't one of the main scientists, but he was there. He did have some involvement, and it's important that he was there because he provided some historical perspective on it years later. But that panel was a lot bigger than J. Allen Hynek, and it's helpful even today. It's almost 70 years later to understand the impact that that panel had on American culture, and I would even say world culture. And yes, it is that important. So this panel, it's a CIA-sponsored scientific panel, happened totally in secret. It occurred back in January 1953. And specifically, it happened during the last week and weekend of the presidency of Harry Truman. Just 2 days after that panel ended, Dwight Eisenhower was sworn in as the next U.S. president. And I'd like you to think about that while I discuss the background of this panel. And eventually, I'll come back to why I think the timing of this panel was significant. To understand the background of the Robertson Panel, we've got to go back to the whole year of 1952. And as every UFO historian has recognized, 1952 was a mammoth year in the history of UFOs. I've talked about this for a long, long time, for many years, since I first started researching UFOs back in the 90s. But I still find that the general public really has a very limited, if any, understanding of just how important that year was. Here on my YouTube channel, there are quite a few videos that talk about a number of important things about the year 1952, and I would encourage you to watch them if you want to learn more. But I can leave it at this. It was a year of an unusually large number of UFO sightings, especially in the United States, many of which were military encounters. Many of these were very high quality in terms of the caliber of the witnesses, the clarity of the visuals themselves, the frequency of electronic tracking of these objects, sometimes simultaneously with visual observation, and definitely the seriousness with which military and intelligence officials were taking these sightings. And those serious statements really only became known to us many years later, after some of the key documents were declassified through Freedom of Information requests. And by the time they became known, mostly several decades later, the moment was clearly lost, and it really didn't matter. And I've often said that when it comes to big government secrets, we usually only learn the truth after it becomes irrelevant. And that's really the case regarding the massive wave of UFO sightings and the behind-the-scenes concern that they generated back then. And this included the middle of summer of 1952 when, for 2 weekends in a row, the newspapers had front-page stories of flying saucers over the Capitol in Washington, D.C., in which, the U.S. Air Force held its largest press conference since the ending of the Second World War to tell the public that these recent sightings were primarily caused by radar instruments misreading unusual weather. And that's what the public was told. And the media dutifully reported this. But we now know that behind the scenes, no one in any responsible position actually believed that. Now, today the public is used to being lied to by the government. We take it as the normal state of things, but not back then, not back in 1952. People actually trusted their government, and they trusted their military in ways that most people today cannot fathom. Now, there are several problems with these sightings from a military and a national security point of view. First, of course, is the question of what these things actually were. We know there were high-level discussions happening in many parts of the American military-industrial complex. Former Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt of Project Blue Book, the actual Project Blue Book, not the TV show, attended many of these meetings. And he wrote explicitly after the fact about how many people at the highest levels readily acknowledged that these objects did not come from our civilization. At least that was their strongly held opinion, and Ruppelt wrote about this. In other words, the ET hypothesis wasn't just some outlier in the military. You would find this at the very top, as far as Ruppelt could see. Secondly, there was the fear that the public would become far too interested in this subject, and that it would become increasingly difficult to contain the public discussion about these objects. This was a real problem. Keep in mind that in 1952, there was no internet. There was no electronic form of communication. It was all newspapers and radio. And yes, many of those were independently owned. So there was actually a lot more freedom of speech in important ways than you get with the corporate media today. But there wasn't an easy way for independent members of the public to, let's say, collect UFO information at that time. And that situation was perfect from the point of view of secrecy, right? But a heightened interest in UFOs by a public that took its rights seriously, well, that could be a real problem. So that was the second problem. Now, the third problem is that there is a fear, and this is expressed in a number of the documents that we have, that somehow the Soviet Union, that is the Russians, might use this situation to their benefit. You got to remember, the Korean War was going on at that time. In other words, the United States was at war with many young men dying overseas. The Soviets and communist China were supporting the enemy in North Korea. And this was a seriously hostile situation. And there was a fear that any mass panic by the American public could be used by the Russians. And here, the analysts were thinking mainly in terms of what they call clogged communication channels. That is, people clogging up the telephone lines, mostly, with flying saucer reports at a time when the Russians might be planning some attack, maybe even on American soil. Even then, that was considered a long shot by most of these analysts, but they actually brought this up a number of times in the declassified documents that we have available. So this was a problem that had to go away from their point of view. The main players we have information about in the background on this was the U.S. Air Force and the CIA. And it's not that the Navy or the Army weren't involved, but behind the scenes, it's quite clear that the Air Force and the CIA were taking the lead, especially the CIA, during the fall of 1952, to do something about this problem. Now, you have to ask yourself, what could they actually do? Well, they clearly could not control these UFOs. That was obvious. You had military encounter after military encounter in which these things were totally outclassing the best that we could offer. Not even close. But what they could do was manage, or let's say control, the public element of the problem, or at least hope to control or manage the public element. That is, to control the information. So from the end of the summer of 1952, right up until the Robertson Panel itself, right up until January 53, you have a number of statements that have come to us over the years, declassified, talking about this. As early as August 1st, 1952, there was an informal memo, and I'm going to show you a quote from this, that was sent from the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, listing all the major explanations. So one would be secret American technology, secret Soviet technology, alien technology, that is extraterrestrial, and then finally misinterpretation of natural as yet little understood phenomenon. Now, the author of that really believed the last. I don't think he believed the first three, but he actually admitted, and I'm going to just show you this little quote, because this is right in there, that the interplanetary aspects of the problem are not being thoroughly excluded from consideration. So we've got that. I think I can stop sharing that. What's the next one I want to show here? Oh yeah, let me just keep reading here, because this is actually key. And he said, like, the main thing is no indication of CIA interest or concern should reach the press or public in view of their probable alarmist tendencies to accept such interest as confirmatory of the soundness of unpublished facts in the hands of the U.S. government. In other words, can't let the public know we have any interest in this thing at all. Bad idea. What's interesting, now here we're still in August of 52, is that the CIA started a series of, you could say, informal discussions about UFOs with other agencies, Air Force and other. And one of the things they kept talking about was this clogged channel problem. One of the very early attendees of these meetings was a very prominent scientist, a brilliant scientist in the defense community. His name was Howard P. Robertson. And I'll come back to, I've got a picture of Robertson I'll show you in a minute. But it's very significant. So he's very much involved in this. So meanwhile, you've got Blue Book Chief Edward Ruppelt. He's giving UFO lectures to packed rooms throughout the military, right? They are into this. Meanwhile, you have the powers behind the scenes who are actively planning to hit the subject of UFOs squarely in the kneecaps. So by November of 1952, a couple of things happened. A, Dwight Eisenhower won the election for presidency. It was kind of a shoo-in. So he was president-elect. He wasn't yet president. Two, the formation around this time, like a week or two before, of the National Security Agency, the NSA, was formed at that time. Very important, right? No one knew about this, of course. So all around this time, November of 52, right after Eisenhower's elected, but before he's sworn in, the Air Force has a review panel on the UFO thing, and they are recommending that a so-called higher court be formed to review the whole thing, the whole case of the UFO, supposedly. And on December 2nd, 1952, I'm going to share this screen with you. You've got the CIA's Director of Scientific Intelligence. That's the man on your left. That's H. Marshall Chadwell. He's the head of scientific intel for CIA at the time. He prepares a secret memo for the director of the CIA. That is Walter Beadle Smith. You see him right there. And, you know, I've quoted this memo many, many times. I consider it very supremely important. Let me move to it. That's actually that's the main page of the memo. There's the second page, and I'm just going to zoom in. Chadwell says to his boss, the director of the CIA, he says, at this time, the reports of incidents convince us that there is something going on that must have immediate attention. Sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles. Oh, let me just go to the next day. You can read that there. That's what Chadwell says to Smith. Now, look, Chadwell is obviously concerned about the UFOs themselves here. You don't need to be a UFO expert to read that. Now, he didn't say, you know, as I like to quip, boss, I think we're being invaded, because you're not going to say that in a top secret memo to your boss. You're going to word this in such a scientific, careful way as possible. But he really leaves out of any other logical alternative, it seems to me. So that was Chadwell's memo. You can see they're taking this very seriously. Attached to his memo was a national security memo, which said that, look, this UFO problem has implications for our national security. So they're very, very upfront about this. And as a result, that memo directed the CIA to formulate and carry out a program to solve the problem of instant positive identification of unidentified flying objects. And that's not what the Robertson panel did. So someone else clearly did that. But immediately after all of this, Memo, you have an intelligence advisory committee, a committee giving the go-ahead for forming this panel. This recommended the director of the CIA to basically gather the scientists together. Chadwell, who wrote the memo, was the driving force here, and he wanted his friend, H.P. Robertson, to head the panel. I think I got Robertson's picture here. A very distinguished Cold War scientist, got the pipe, got the look, and he was actually a very brilliant man. Robertson, during the Second World War, was also a scientist who had studied the Foo Fighters, those UFOs in World War II. So he actually was quite familiar with this whole problem. And Robertson's job was to bring on the other members of the panel, and which he soon did. So we can see that 1952, all right, let me just review this before I get into the panel, brought concern about UFOs to a peak within the United States military, within the intelligence community. As far as we can tell, actually, the presidency itself, because you've got Harry Truman getting briefings by this man here from the summer of 1948 onward. This is, well, Robert B. Landry, who Truman is just promoting to general. Landry had been a colonel back in 1948 when he was charged with briefing Truman quarterly on UFOs, which he did for 4.5 years in conjunction with the CIA, just so that you know. And we know this happened, by the way, because in Landry's retirement in the early 70s, right after I think Truman had died, Landry himself was interviewed after his long career. And at the very end, the interviewer asked Landry about UFOs. And you can read this transcript, and Landry's stumbling around here. And he's like, well, you know, the president, like anyone else, is interested in UFOs. Yeah, like any other citizen, sure. And he mentioned that he was charged with briefing Truman on UFOs quarterly. He said, well, we didn't find anything, of course. There was nothing there. Well, that's a lot of nonsense, because all you have to do is look at the history of UFOs from 1948 to 1953, and you see that this was absolutely critical military and aviation encounters again and again and again. I've written about it over and over again, so have other people. But anyway, here's Truman and Landry, and you can see they were absolutely deeply interested in this as well. So you've got all of this concern, all right? And then you got Chadwell's memo, you know, written. Keep in mind, you know, back in the summer of 1952, the Air Force lays all this out to the public saying, that's just misidentification. But 4 months after that, Chadwell's writing his memo saying, this is a serious problem, and showing extreme bewilderment about these UFOs and actually concern over what these exotic things were over American skies. And then, you know, also you got a strong contingent, I didn't even mention this here, within the Navy, within the Air Force, that truly believe UFOs are extraterrestrial. You've got the FBI that was continuing to report on UFO developments to their boss, J. Edgar Hoover. And most importantly, you've got American jets again and again trying to intercept these objects in their airspace. So that's a situation. So you've got every indication that the American government is taking this problem very seriously, and that, in fact, every indication that this was a state of crisis. Now, another thing. Ever since the summer of 1952, it was quite obvious, let's say very highly probable, that Dwight Eisenhower would win the presidential election against the person who was running against him. That was Adlai Stevenson. Eisenhower was a huge, heavy favorite. And in fact, of course, he won easily. The people in Harry Truman's staff clearly knew that the Republican Party was very waiting for a major house cleaning after November, right? So you've got that whole thing. Now, under any situation, you know, when you have a new administration and a new party coming into power, like, there's always going to be a big adjustment. There's always going to be house cleaning. Even within the CIA, they realized that, you know, the new people coming in was probably going to bring in big changes, and that would probably include a new director of the CIA, which it did. But what about an adjustment for a UFO control group? Now, you think about this. Ever since the UFO problem had been this recognized thing, there had been one man who had been president and that was Harry Truman. And that prospect was about to end. And so we have to recognize that the people managing this problem wanted to keep this whole thing secure. And you want to keep information away from the wrong people. And, you know, they weren't going to let mere changes in the presidency and the party that was running things. They were going to let that to affect how they were going to handle this all-important problem. So that's one thing. At the same time, something else was happening at this period. You could call it a UFO party, a new group of people, small group of people within the military, within the civilians as well. People like Donald Kehoe, people like Frank Edwards, who was a radio broadcaster. You've got these civilian groups as well that were popping up. People within the military as well that were pushing for more and more UFO openness. Now, this had been a problem for a while, but now in the aftermath of all of these sightings in 1952, and now facing all of these uncertainties inherent in a new administration, even someone like Eisenhower, who, yes, was a team player, military man, you still never know. There's change. So with all of that, it's very obvious that this UFO party would have to be silenced, would have to be discredited, because otherwise this was a problem that really could get out of hand. So what you have at this time is an immediate goal and a long-term goal. The immediate goal was to silence and to discredit the UFO group. And the long-term goal, I would say, was to ensure that no major mistakes would ever occur again by any new people taking charge in new administrations. And that was the significance of the Robertson Panel. That's what it was. So the Robertson Panel met from January 14th, 1953 to January 18th, 1953. Just 2 days after it ended, Dwight Eisenhower was sworn in as U.S. president. So this was the last matter of any importance in Harry Truman's 8 years as a president. Just think about that. So when you see it in this perspective, the panel's significance is not that it just served to debunk UFOs, which is what, yes, everyone has acknowledged, but rather this panel was a final insurance policy to steer UFOs away from the wrong people, to keep this subject being investigated by too many individuals, by too many departments within the Eisenhower White House presidency. The Robertson Panel was the Truman administration's last bit of house cleaning. That's really what it was. If you want an organization to do this, you're not going to go to something like the recently created National Science Foundation. You'd think, yeah, sure, the NSF, they're all scientists. That's the logical candidate to take this subject on. But no, not the National Science Foundation. It's very significant that the organization entrusted with running this panel was the very same organization that was involved at that time in mind control experiments, in disinformation, in foreign coups, in media manipulation through things like Operation Mockingbird, control of the media, involved in the secret collection of UFO reports, involved in the surveillance against American UFO researchers. Look, if the job that you need is not to get to the bottom of a scientific question, but rather to control a multi-headed hydra, then the CIA is what you want. And that's the setting for the Robertson Panel, which was held in total secrecy. It was denied for many, many years after the fact. Now, the details of the Robertson Panel to me are less interesting, but they're still interesting. All right, a few things are very clear. One, UFO historian Michael Sword showed many years later that the actual conclusions of this panel were decided upon and probably written before it even convened. So that's interesting. Two, the scientists involved, well, all of these scientists were very high caliber. Yeah, that's true. They were Nobel level, some of them. They met for a total of 12 hours. And not all of them were even there all the time. One of them, Lloyd Berkner, came on the very last day. He's like, I'm here finally. Here's a picture of the ones that Robertson brought in. And, you know, as I say, they're an impressive group of guys. This is Luis Alvarez, Samuel Goudsmith, Thornton Page. Page wearing that eye patch, that's a picture of from a little over 10 years later. I couldn't find a good 1950s picture of him. And then on the end, Lloyd Berkner. They're along with Robertson, they were the high-level guys. And then there were other people. There was, CIA, jumping ahead of myself here. CIA members, that's the picture of Eisenhower I never showed you. There were members of Philip Strong, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Oder, a man named David Stevenson, and key was a CIA officer named Frederick Durant was also there. Durant is actually the one who wrote the fundamentals of the Robertson Panel report. He actually did it before it started. In fact, I've got a picture of Durant I want to show you. Here he is. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about this here. So what did they actually do? They reviewed, there was some very interesting UFO film video that was shot during the previous year or two. They looked at that. One of those actually had received, I think, over 1,000 man-hours of U.S. Navy analysis, which concluded that this was an extraordinary, unknown thing, and definitely not birds in the sky. There's a whole story behind this, shot by a Navy warrant officer named Delbert Newhouse the previous summer. It was quite interesting. Newhouse was with his wife. He had a Bell and Howell camera. They saw this thing very low in the sky, these objects, and he gets his camera out, sets it up. It's not like you've got an iPhone these days and you can shoot it instantly. He had to get the whole thing going. By the time he got his camera recording, the objects had receded, he said, very high up in the sky. But he said these were absolute saucer-shaped objects moving in an incredible way. Even so, the video he had was quite amazing. So during the Robertson panel, the scientists were shown this, and it's very interesting that the CIA arranged to have the panel also see a motion picture film of seagulls. It's a very obvious hint at what they wanted them to conclude. Like, let's not lead the scientists in any way, shall we? And then you got to wonder, why would the CIA get motion pictures of seagulls in the air anyway? Now back to Alan Hynek. He actually was part of the panel a little bit. He briefed them on some research being done at a place known as the Battelle Memorial Institute in Ohio, which unfortunately, that's a whole other tragic cover-up. I'll have to deal with that another time. And then there were Air Force officers who briefed the panel, trying to get the panel to take this subject seriously. And they were lobbying, actually, to do a serious investigation of UFOs. They wanted the panel to declassify as many reports as possible. They said, look, you got to enlarge Project Blue Book. In other words, there were people briefing the panel who took this actually seriously. They were totally misled by what this panel was. They're thinking this is a genuine opportunity to study UFOs properly, scientifically. Well, they had no idea what the real purpose was. So after several days, now you're to Friday morning, January 17th, second to last day of the panel. Robertson is looking over everything. He says, okay, I'll draft the panel report and I'll present it tomorrow morning. So he must have seriously burned some midnight oil. But of course, he wasn't burning any midnight oil, since Frederick Durant had already written it. By 11 o'clock the next morning, that report was at the desk of the CIA Director, Walter Beadle Smith. He's shown it. Air Force Director of Intelligence, General John Samford, was shown it. Samford was the guy who did the press conference the summer before. Both of them loved the report. That's great job. That's some mighty fast work when you really think about it. They spent the last day basically reworking the draft. I mean, you have to assume that at least some of the report had to reflect the work of the previous week, so they got that in there. So very predictably, the panel just totally debunked UFOs. They're like, there's no sound data in most of these cases. Most of these sightings can be explained if you just had more data. It's not worth the effort to investigate these sightings because they don't really turn out to be anything. There's no evidence UFOs are a threat to national security, despite what Chadwell's memo just a month earlier had explicitly stated. They just ignored that. They ignored hundreds of UFO reports that were incredibly powerful. They ignored all the implications of the video. So UFOs are just no big deal. But what they did care about was managing the public dimension of the UFO problem. And you got to wonder why a group of scientists are going to be expressing an opinion on a matter of national security, which you'd think would be something completely outside their collective expertise and also outside their mandate, which is to come to a scientific conclusion about what this was. But no, that's not what they spent their time on. They spent it on how do we manage this from a public point of view. So obviously, these men were not working as scientists. They were working as national security strategists, essentially. And what they decided with that was possibly dangerous, this is their words, to have the military service foster public concern in what they called nocturnal meandering lights. They really just put this whole thing down. And so what they recommended was what they called an educational or training program targeted to the public to eliminate, this is their words, I didn't give you a quote here, the popular feeling that every sighting, no matter how poor the data, must be explained in detail. Their whole attitude is, this is not worth focusing on because you're just going to get the people worked up. So you just got to put this to sleep. They had what they recommended, an educational program of training and debunking. And this is the quote that I think I want to read to you here. The whole thing here, the debunking aim would result in reduction in public interest in flying saucers, which today evokes a strong psychological reaction. This education could be accomplished by mass media, such as television, motion pictures, and popular articles. And, you keep in mind, like this, to them, managing major media, no biggie at all. That was a foregone conclusion. They knew that they could do this. And they're recommending people like Disney as, famously, as we all know, as helping out with the cause, which in fact they did. And of course, all the major media, which was already cooperating through things like Operation Mockingbird, management of the media, were on board with this, as they always were. And by the way, Alan Hynek, who, look, he had a very laudable career in many ways within this, but we don't want to rewrite history here. Hynek later said he was, quote, negatively impressed by the panel, okay. But actually at the time, Hynek was a team player, and he said, yeah, we can get some amateur astronomers in the U.S. who might be a source of, he called enthusiastic talent to spread the news, spread the gospel, that is to debunk UFOs. So Hynek certainly offered his support to do this at the time. But again, I would emphasize, as the 1950s went by and into the 60s, Hynek really was a sophisticated student of the UFO phenomenon, but he was all very willing, in this period to do his part to help out. The other thing that the panel really focused on was the need to monitor, really spy on civilian UFO groups. There was one known as the Civilian Flying Saucer Investigators that started in 1951, and they actually mentioned it, that they need monitoring. And then APRO, Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, wasn't explicitly mentioned, and Hynek said he never actually heard APRO being mentioned in there, but Coral and James Lorenzen were monitored, and they were quite convinced they were monitored as early as the 1950s. And I think it's quite obvious that the CIA had them in their crosshairs as well. The whole thing is that studying UFOs was subversive in their idea, which is something that even skeptical organizations maintained this throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 21st century. It's like, it's subversive it undermines faith in government to believe in UFO conspiracies. They actually would say this nonsense. Anyway, that's the fundamentals. The other thing that you find with the panel is that the people who participated in this, a lot of their assumptions were shockingly ignorant. Thornton Page, one of the senior members, his attitude, he considered the ET hypothesis, quote, quite preposterous. He said, look, how are you going to get intelligent life anywhere else in this solar system? And why would UFOs be confined to any one continent, as if all the reports were from the United States? I mean, you really have to wonder, was he that ignorant, which it seems he was, of the whole global nature of UFOs, even back in the 50s? And it seems that he was. He just didn't know anything. And yet he was supposedly on this panel to scientifically study UFOs for the classified world. So there was no actual science here. All right. You know, and as I said, they dismissed all the film evidence. All the hundreds of good reports were ignored. So that's it. The whole thing was preordained. And Hynek later said, look, I could tell they were in a debunking mood right out of the gate. Other people participating, Air Force officer Dewey Fournet, said the same thing. And, you know, you've had some researchers over the years say, well, how could the CIA manipulate a group of Nobel caliber scientists to reach a certain conclusion? But that's kind of silly. I mean, first of all, you don't have to micromanage these people if you select the right people to begin with. And believe me, the members of the Robertson panel were strongly connected with the military and the national security state. This was not a detached, impartial jury that was going to withhold their decision until they could objectively review the evidence. All right. That's the opposite of what they were. One of the members, Thornton Page, later, this is actually what Page said. Robertson, this is on the first day, the first private session where there were no outsiders allowed. He said, Robertson told us that our job was to reduce public concern and to show that UFO reports could be explained by conventional reasoning. So you've got it from one of the senior panel members himself. And, you know, you ask yourself, doesn't it seem odd that, you know, following such a grave crisis of well-documented UFO sightings during the whole year of 1952, that the best that the scientific military intelligence establishment could come up with was the Robertson Panel, a study of the problem that was, at least scientifically, totally incompetent? On the face of it, it doesn't make any sense, right? And it really leaves a bad taste, even after all these years, the Robertson Panel. And I think partly because you've got Nobel caliber scientists who are involved in such scientifically shallow and deficient work. So you ask yourself, would the CIA really entrust policy-making authority to a group which, yeah, prestigious, they were, yes, but couldn't even come up with an informed, bare bones informed decision on the subject? And the thing is, this is where we get to the core importance of the Robertson Panel. See, the point was not for them to arrive at a conclusion. The point was, you have a group by their very prestige was able to sanction a policy that was already decided upon. That's it. Within the classified world, as well as in the public world, you gotta CYA. You've got to cover your vulnerable areas. And what better way than with a panel composed of Nobel-level scientists that was needed to defuse the UFO problems, not figure it out. What the CIA wanted, what the Air Force wanted, they didn't want an actual study of the problem. They had enough of those studies. What they needed, and they needed fast, was justifying a policy decision. And the policies that followed the Robertson Panel, this is really what we call a major crackdown against UFO publicity. And that did happen absolutely in the aftermath of the panel, not just within the civilian world, but within the military as well. So it's not that the Robertson Panel created these policies. The Robertson Panel itself was created by the same policy way back in the summer of '52 that had decided these UFOs, we're going to put this whole thing to sleep as far as the public is concerned. So that's the panel. 2 days later, Eisenhower is inaugurated as the president. On that very day, H.P. Robertson wrote a letter to his good friend, Chadwell, the author of the report, and this is what he said. Perhaps that'll take care of the Forteans for a while. Yeah, he actually wrote that. Oh, yeah, and by the way, he also mentioned in that same letter that he had a scheduled meeting with the, quote, NSA group a few weeks later. So that shows Robertson was very well plugged in, not just with the CIA, but also the NSA, which was a brand new organization at the time, ultra secret. No one knew back then about the NSA, but Robertson did. That's the Robertson Panel. A complete cover-up, and nothing of what it was, said to be even years later. This is not a scientific panel, not at all. By calling it a scientific panel, we really do an injustice to science itself. It's an insult to science to call the Robertson Panel anything other than an officially sanctioned lies and cover-up to put UFOs away from the public point of view. And it worked for quite a long time. And in fact, I would say that the aftermath of the Robertson Panel has continued with us even to this day. Things have changed a bit in the last few years with UFOs in terms of public perception, and it's a good thing. But it's not because of official changes in government policy. It's because of effective fighting against that government policy. That's my argument. And the Robertson Panel, those conclusions have really become part of global culture, unfortunately. They affected academia, they affected the media, they affected the political institutions, all walks of life. It became very obvious during the 1950s that if you really start talking about these flying saucers, not going to be good for your career, so you better not try. A lot of that really comes down from the recommendations of the Robertson Panel. That's their dark legacy to this day. Well, I went a little longer than normal for these live streams, but I had a lot to say. That's all I got right now. I'd like to thank you for joining me today. And as always, I'd like to say, if you support what I do, please subscribe to this channel. Please like and share this video. And you can also visit my websites, Richard Dolan Press, and most importantly, Richard Dolan Members, where with my wife, Tracy, we put up fresh content all the time. We live in very interesting times, and UFOs are part of those interesting times. And it's a subject that's not going to go away. So with that, I'll catch you next time. Thanks very much. Bye.